The October frost clung to the undergrowth like crystalline spider webs, capturing the first light of dawn in thousands of miniature prisms. The hunter's boots crunched through the thin layer of ice that had formed overnight on the forest floor. Each exhale produced a cloud of vapor that hung momentarily in the air before dissolving into the morning chill. This particular stretch of national forest in northern Minnesota had been the hunter's sanctuary for nearly 2 decades, a place where the noise of civilization faded to a distant memory. At 47, the hunter carried himself with the quiet confidence that came from years spent reading the subtle language of the wilderness. His weathered face, lined from countless hours under the open sky, told the story of a life lived in harmony with nature's rhythms. 19 seasons of tracking, waiting, and harvesting had honed his senses to detect the slightest disruptions in the forest's patterns. The hunter adjusted the weight of his rifle against his shoulder, a trusted Remington 700 that had accompanied him since his early 30s. The scope had been upgraded twice, but the stock remained the same, worn smooth in the places where his hands naturally fell. His father had taught him to hunt in these very woods, passing down knowledge that stretched back generations. His life outside these forests was comfortable, but complicated. A divorce 8 years prior had left him with weekend custody of 2 children who were now entering their teenage years. They respected his knowledge of the outdoors, but were increasingly drawn to the digital world, a realm where the hunter felt as out of place as a smartphone would in this primeval setting. His job as a construction supervisor provided stability, but these solitary hunting trips were what restored his soul. The forest felt different today. The hunter had noticed it from the moment he'd left his truck at the trailhead 3 miles back. The chickadees, normally flitting from branch to branch with cheerful calls, were conspicuously silent. Even the wind seemed reluctant to stir the pine needles. The usual symphony of the forest had been replaced by an unsettling quietude that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He paused near a large white oak, its trunk wider than the span of his arms. Setting his pack down, he withdrew a thermos of coffee and poured the steaming liquid into the cup. The familiar aroma of dark roast mingled with the earthy scent of decaying leaves. As he sipped, his eyes scanned the surrounding woods, noting the absence of squirrel activity in the canopy above. Strange, he murmured to himself, his breath visible in the crisp air. The hunter had always prided himself on his acute awareness of his surroundings. It was more than training. It was intuition, the kind that couldn't be taught but was essential for survival. Something was off balance in his forest today. He'd seen similar behavior from wildlife before major storms or when predators moved through an area, but the barometer reading from his weather app had shown stable conditions, and mountain lions were extremely rare in this region. He finished his coffee, returned the cup to his thermos, and continued his trek deeper into the forest. The sun had now cleared the horizon, but its light seemed diffused and weak, barely penetrating the canopy. The forest floor remained in shadows, the moss-covered logs and ferns appearing almost monochromatic in the subdued illumination. The hunter moved with deliberate steps, his footfalls nearly silent despite his solid frame. Years of practice had taught him how to distribute his weight, how to test each step before committing to it. He moved like the predator he was, patient, methodical, aware. His planned route would take him to a ridge overlooking a small valley, where deer frequently grazed at this time of year. It was a spot he returned to season after season, one that had rarely disappointed. But today, his instincts pulled him in a different direction. Instead of continuing straight toward the ridge, he found himself veering eastward, toward a section of the forest he rarely visited. The terrain became increasingly rough as he moved away from the familiar path. The underbrush grew thicker, and the trees closed in, their branches forming a tight canopy overhead. He wasn't sure why he felt compelled to explore this area now, but he had learned long ago to trust his intuition. After nearly an hour of pushing through dense vegetation, the hunter emerged at the edge of a small clearing. The sudden absence of trees created a perfect circle of sky above, the blue expanse a stark contrast to the shadowy forest. In the center of the clearing stood a structure that seemed entirely out of place in this remote wilderness. A cabin. The hunter paused, studying the building from the tree line. According to his mental map of the area, there shouldn't be any structures for miles. This was protected federal land, where new construction was strictly prohibited. Yet, there it stood, a crude but sturdy-looking cabin, its logs weathered to a silvery gray that suggested considerable age. No smoke rose from the stone chimney, no footprints marked the thin layer of frost covering the clearing. The small windows were dark, some with broken panes, The hunter remained motionless, observing, listening. The silence around the cabin seemed even deeper than in the surrounding forest, as if the structure existed in its own pocket of isolation, separate from the natural world. Against his better judgment, the hunter felt an inexplicable pull toward the abandoned structure. Decades of experience in these woods had taught him caution, but something about this discovery demanded investigation. Setting his jaw with determination, he stepped out of the protective shadows of the forest and into the clearing, the first human to disturb this forgotten place in what appeared to be a very long time. The hunter's approach to the cabin was measured and cautious. With each step across the frost-covered clearing, the sense of wrongness intensified. No birds called. No insects buzzed. The only sound was the soft crunch of his boots breaking through the frozen ground cover. The cabin itself seemed to absorb the ambient noise, creating a vacuum of silence that pressed against his eardrums. From 20 yards away, details began to emerge that weren't visible from the forest edge. The cabin's door hung at an awkward angle, partially open, one hinge apparently broken. A small porch extended from the front, its wooden planks warped and split from years of exposure to the elements. Beneath the eaves, cobwebs had formed intricate patterns, undisturbed by any recent movement. The hunter stopped 10 yards from the structure, eyes narrowed as he assessed potential risks. In his years traversing these forests, he'd encountered abandoned hunting camps before, even the occasional illegal marijuana grow operation. But those had distinct signatures, human patterns, logical layouts. This cabin seemed different, its placement and construction following no recognizable purpose. He circled the perimeter slowly, maintaining his distance. The cabin was larger than he'd initially thought, with a main structure and what appeared to be a smaller addition at the back. A stack of firewood, long since rotted to a pulpy mass, leaned against the western wall. The metal roof, once red, had faded to a rusty orange and was punctured in several places, allowing glimpses of the interior rafters. The hunter's breathing had become shallow without his conscious awareness. His hand rested on the butt of his hunting knife, a reflexive gesture of preparation. He'd tracked wounded bears through dense underbrush with less apprehension than he felt approaching this silent structure. "Hello," he called out, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. "Anyone here?" The words fell flat in the clearing, absorbed by the surrounding trees. No response came from the cabin. The hunter unshouldered his pack and removed a heavy-duty flashlight. Though daylight illuminated the clearing, the cabin's interior would be dim, especially with the windows partially obscured by dirt and cobwebs. He checked his cell phone. No service, as expected in this remote area. He made a mental note of his position relative to the trail he'd left hours earlier. As he approached the front door, his trained eye noticed something unusual about the ground. Unlike the rest of the clearing, the area directly in front of the cabin showed signs of recent disturbance. The frost pattern was broken in places, forming a rough pathway that led to and from the entrance. Someone, or something, had been here within the last day or two. The hunter's pulse quickened. He examined the disturbed area more closely, kneeling to inspect what might be footprints. The impressions were obscured by frost and the forest detritus, but they didn't match any animal tracks he recognized. They seemed almost human, but the stride length was irregular, and the impression depth varied wildly, as if whatever made them had an unnatural gait. He stood, wiping his hands on his camouflage pants. Every instinct told him to mark this location on his GPS and report it to the Forest Service. The rational part of his mind constructed perfectly sound reasons to turn back. Daylight hours were limited. He was alone in a remote area. His hunting trip was being delayed. Yet the same inexplicable pull that had drawn him off his planned route now drew him toward the cabin's entrance. In nearly 2 decades of hunting, he'd developed an almost supernatural connection to these woods. If something was wrong here, and everything about this scene screamed that something was, he felt a responsibility to investigate. The hunter reached for the partially open door, hesitating just before his fingers touched the weathered wood. In that moment of suspended action, he noticed a symbol carved into the frame. Crude but deliberate markings that resembled no forestry or trail notation he'd ever encountered. The lines formed an asymmetrical pattern that seemed to shift when viewed peripherally, like an optical illusion. Swallowing hard, he pushed the door fully open. The hinges protested with a long, agonized creak that echoed through the clearing. Stale air rushed out, carrying with it an odor so foul that the hunter reflexively stepped back, covering his nose and mouth with his sleeve. It wasn't the smell of decay or animal musk. scents he was familiar with from field dressing game. This was something chemical yet organic, like fermentation gone horribly wrong. When the initial wave of odor dissipated, he steeled himself and directed his flashlight into the cabin's interior. The beam cut through dust particles dancing in the air, illuminating a single room that appeared to serve as both living quarters and kitchen. A crude table stood in the center, surrounded by 3 mismatched chairs. Shelves lined the walls, containing an assortment of canned goods, their labels long since faded to illegibility. The hunter's eyes were drawn to the far wall, where a stone fireplace dominated the space. Above the mantel, something had been affixed to the logs, photographs or papers. He couldn't tell from the doorway. He stepped inside, floorboards groaning under his weight. The temperature inside the cabin was noticeably colder than outside, defying the natural insulating properties of the log structure. The hunter's breath formed clouds more dense and lingering than those in the clearing. His flashlight beam tracked across the room, revealing details that seemed increasingly incongruous with an abandoned hunting cabin. A modern camera tripod stood in one corner, its aluminum legs incongruous among the rustic furnishings. Next to it, a digital voice recorder rested on a stool, a small red light indicating it was still operational. Still recording. The hunter approached it cautiously, noting that its manufacture date couldn't be more than a few years old. On the table lay an open journal, its pages filled with cramped handwriting that degenerated from neat, ordered paragraphs to frantic scribbles. Beside it sat a collection of small glass vials, some containing soil samples, others holding what appeared to be hair or fiber. The hunter's professional instincts took over, analyzing the scene with detached precision. Someone had been using this abandoned cabin as a base for some kind of research or investigation. The equipment was high quality, not the kind of gear typically abandoned. Whatever had happened here had happened suddenly, unexpectedly. He moved toward the fireplace, drawn to the items mounted on the wall above it. As his flashlight illuminated the display, his heart rate spiked, and a cold sweat broke out across his forehead. Photographs, dozens of them, pinned haphazardly to the logs. Black and white images showing the clearing at different times of day. Infrared shots of the forest at night, and in each one, barely visible until you knew to look for it, a figure, tall, unnaturally thin, standing just at the edge of the frame. In some photos, it appeared to be watching the cabin. In others, it seemed to be moving toward it, its form blurred as if captured in rapid motion. The hunter's hand trembled slightly, causing the flashlight beam to dance across the photographs. One image in particular caught his attention, a close-up shot that appeared to show the figure's face, or what served as its face. The features were indistinct, almost fluid, as if constantly shifting. A noise from the rear of the cabin snapped the hunter back to his immediate surroundings. A soft thud, like something heavy settling, or a careful footstep. He spun, directing his light toward the sound, toward the doorway that presumably led to the cabin's back addition. "Who's there?" he demanded, voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. Silence answered him, but it was a different quality of silence than before. Expectant, as if the cabin itself were holding its breath. The hunter's mind raced through his options. Leave immediately and report to authorities. Continue investigating alone. Call out again. His training and experience screamed for caution, but the professional curiosity that made him an exceptional tracker urged him forward. He took a step toward the back doorway, then another. Whatever awaited him there, he would face it with the same methodical approach that had served him through countless hunts. He would document what he found, analyze it, understand it. What he didn't yet realize was that this discovery would fundamentally alter not just his understanding of these familiar woods, but of reality itself. The hunter paused at the threshold of the doorway leading to the cabin's rear addition. His flashlight beam penetrated only a few feet into the darkness beyond, revealing rough-hewn walls and what appeared to be shelving units along one side. The strange odor he'd noticed upon entering was stronger here, with metallic undertones that reminded him of blood, though not quite. He reached into his pack and retrieved his phone, activating its camera function. Though he couldn't call out, he could still document what he found. If something happened to him, at least there would be a record. The thought sent an involuntary shiver down his spine. In 19 years of hunting, he'd never seriously considered the possibility of not returning from the forest. "I'm coming in," he announced, unsure why he felt compelled to announce his presence to what was likely an empty room. He stepped through the doorway. sweeping his flashlight methodically from left to right. The addition was approximately 12 feet square, with no windows and a lower ceiling than the main cabin. The air was noticeably thicker here, almost viscous with humidity despite the October chill. Along the left wall stood metal shelving units that would not have looked out of place in a laboratory, laden with equipment whose purpose the hunter couldn't begin to guess. But it was the center of the room that commanded his attention. A large table dominated the space, its surface covered with a tarp. Beneath the covering, something bulky and irregular created a landscape of peaks and valleys in the heavy fabric. Surrounding the table, the floor was marked with a series of symbols drawn in what appeared to be charcoal, similar to the marking he'd noticed on the door frame, but more elaborate, forming a complete circle around the table. The hunter raised his phone and took several photographs, making sure to capture the symbols on the floor from multiple angles. He stepped carefully over the markings, approaching the covered table with growing apprehension. Using the tip of his hunting knife, he lifted one corner of the tarp. The flashlight revealed a collection of bones. Not the clean, bleached bones one might find in a medical classroom, but darkened, oddly jointed specimens that seemed assembled in an attempt to recreate a complete skeleton. Some pieces were clearly animal in origin. The hunter recognized deer, bear, and what might be wolf. Others were more difficult to classify, with proportions and structures that matched no North American wildlife he was familiar with. Most disturbing were the fragments that appeared almost human, yet subtly wrong. Elongated finger bones with too many joints, a partial skull with an unnaturally sloped cranium, vertebrae with projections unlike anything in standard anatomy. The hunter let the tarp fall back into place, his mind struggling to process what he'd seen. He took several steps back until he felt the wall behind him, then slowly slid down to a sitting position, his flashlight directed at the covered table. "What the hell?" he whispered, the words hardly more than an exhaled breath. He remained there for several minutes, his trained mind cataloging details and forming hypotheses despite his shock. The most rational explanation was that someone was conducting unauthorized research, perhaps a rogue biologist or anthropologist studying local wildlife. The less rational explanations he pushed aside, unwilling to entertain them in the light of day. Eventually, professional curiosity overcame his initial reaction. He rose and continued his examination of the room, photographing the equipment on the shelves. Much of it was specialized and unfamiliar. Glass containers connected by plastic tubing, a device that resembled a centrifuge, instruments that might be used for measuring or recording data. On a small desk in the corner, he found more concrete evidence of human presence. A backpack, relatively new, containing clothing, protein bars, and a first aid kit. A laminated identification card for a university research program, though water damage had rendered the name and institution illegible. A satellite phone, its battery dead, and a leather-bound notebook, different from the journal in the main room. The hunter flipped through the notebook, finding page after page of meticulous notes written in a tight, precise hand. The entries were dated, the most recent from just 6 days ago. Many passages contained scientific terminology he didn't understand, but certain phrases jumped out with alarming clarity. Frequency of sightings increasing. The specimen appears to be mimicking rather than actually transforming. Locals report missing pets, but no human disappearances yet. Unclear whether it's a single entity or multiple. A folded newspaper clipping fell from between the pages. The hunter opened it to find a short article from the County Gazette, dated 3 months prior. Local hiker reports. Strange encounter in National Forest. Regional authorities dismiss claims as wildlife misidentification or hoax. The hunter refolded the clipping and returned it to the notebook, which he placed in his pack. Whatever had happened here, this evidence might be crucial for authorities to understand. He made a final sweep of both rooms, collecting the digital voice recorder and the more recent journal as well. As he prepared to leave, a glint of metal caught his eye beneath one of the chairs in the main room, a set of keys attached to a Forest Service keychain. He pocketed these too, reasoning they might help identify the cabin's most recent occupant. Outside, the afternoon light had taken on the golden quality of approaching sunset. The hunter had spent nearly 2 hours investigating the cabin, far longer than he'd realized. He needed to start back toward the trail immediately if he hoped to reach his truck before full dark. As he crossed the clearing, he paused to look back at the structure. In the slanting sunlight, the cabin seemed more ominous than before, its windows like vacant eyes watching his departure. For a moment, he thought he saw movement behind one of the broken panes. a shifting shadow that didn't correspond to any swaying branches or natural explanation. He raised his binoculars for a closer look, but saw only darkness within. The return journey through the forest seemed faster, fueled by a desire to put distance between himself and the cabin. The hunter moved with purpose, no longer the silent stalker of game, but a man intent on reaching civilization. The normal sounds of the forest gradually returned as he got farther from the clearing. Chickadees calling, squirrels chattering, the rustle of wind through pine needles. By the time he reached his truck, dusk had fallen. The hunter stowed his gear, placed the items collected from the cabin in a separate waterproof bag, and sat behind the wheel for several minutes, collecting his thoughts. The sheriff's department was the logical first step. The county had jurisdiction over most issues in the national forest, working in conjunction with Forest Service law enforcement when necessary. He started the engine and headed toward the county seat, 20 miles of winding forest roads away. The sheriff's office was housed in a single-story brick building that also contained the county jail and emergency services dispatch. At this hour, only a skeleton crew staffed the facility. The hunter approached the front desk, where a deputy in his early 30s sat reviewing paperwork. "Can I help you?" the deputy asked, glancing up with the wary look of someone who expected nothing but trouble this late in the shift. "I need to report something I found in the national forest," the hunter replied, placing his waterproof bag on the counter. The deputy's expression shifted from wariness to mild annoyance. "If this is about illegal camping or ATVs in restricted areas, you should contact the Forest Service in the morning. It's more serious than that," the hunter said. "I found an abandoned cabin with some disturbing contents. Scientific equipment, journals documenting something in the forest, bones arranged in unnatural configurations." The deputy's eyebrows rose slightly. "An unauthorized structure? That's still Forest Service territory, sir." "I think someone was conducting experiments out there," the hunter persisted, unzipping the bag to reveal the voice recorder and notebooks. "Possibly tracking something dangerous. There are references to missing pets, strange sightings." The deputy held up a hand. "Slow down. Let's start with the basics. I'll need your name, contact information, and the exact location of this cabin." For the next 30 minutes, the hunter provided details of his discovery, showing the photographs he'd taken and explaining the condition of the site. The deputy took notes with increasing reluctance, his initial skepticism hardening into bureaucratic disengagement. "So you entered this cabin without permission, removed items that weren't yours, and now you're reporting what exactly? Trespassing by unknown parties? Unauthorized scientific research? Possible animal remains?" "I'm reporting something that doesn't make sense," the hunter replied, frustration edging into his voice. "Something that might be dangerous. Those bones weren't just animal remains. Some of them were wrong." The deputy closed his notebook. "Mr. Hunter, I appreciate your concern, but this sounds like a matter for Fish and Wildlife or the Forest Service. I'll file a report and forward it to the appropriate agencies, but I have to be honest. Unless there's evidence of a crime against persons or major property damage, this isn't going to be high priority." The hunter had anticipated this response, but still felt a surge of disappointment. "Will someone at least check out the site? There was recent activity there within the last week." "I'll make a note of that in my report," the deputy said, his tone making it clear how little weight that note would carry. "You might want to follow up with the Forest Service Ranger Station tomorrow. They might be more interested, especially if it involves unauthorized structures on federal land." The hunter gathered his evidence, leaving only the newspaper clipping as an attachment to the official report. As he turned to leave, the deputy called after him. "Sir, next time you're hunting, maybe stick to tracking deer instead of mysteries. Safer that way." The drive back to his rented cabin near the lake was a blur of headlights and forest shadows. The hunter's mind raced with images from the abandoned structure, the photographs showing the strange figure, the assembled bones, the frantic journal entries. He'd expected disbelief from authorities, but the deputy's complete dismissal left him with a sense of responsibility he couldn't shake. Inside his simple but comfortable rental, he spread the items from the cabin across the kitchen table. The voice recorder's battery indicator showed it was nearly depleted. If he wanted to hear what was on it, he'd need to act quickly. He connected it to his laptop and downloaded the audio files, then set the device aside to charge. The most recent journal entries grew increasingly erratic, describing sounds outside the cabin at night, glimpses of movement just at the edge of detection, and a growing paranoia about being watched. The final entry, dated 6 days ago, contained just 3 lines. It knows I'm recording it. It's getting closer every night. If I don't leave tomorrow, I don't think I'll be able to leave at all. The hunter stared at those words for a long time, a chill running through him that had nothing to do with the cabin's heating system. He glanced at the windows, suddenly aware of how dark it had become outside, how the glass reflected the interior lights and turned the panes into black mirrors. He rose and drew the curtains closed, then returned to the table. Sleep seemed impossible now. Instead, he opened his laptop and began organizing his findings, creating a detailed document with photographs, journal excerpts, and his own observations. If the authorities wouldn't take this seriously, he would investigate further on his own. Tomorrow, he would return to the forest, not to hunt deer, but to hunt answers. The abandoned cabin had awakened something in him, a need to understand, to bring light to whatever lurked in those woods. As he worked through the night, one thought kept returning, pushing away exhaustion and caution alike. Whatever had frightened the cabin's previous occupant enough to make them flee, leaving valuable equipment behind, was still out there, and now it knew the hunter had found its lair. Morning arrived with pale light filtering through the rental cabin's windows. The hunter had barely slept, his mind churning with questions about what he'd discovered in the forest. The digital voice recorder sat on the table before him, now fully charged, its contents downloaded to his laptop. He'd spent hours listening to the recordings, scientific observations gradually giving way to increasingly paranoid ramblings about being watched, stalked, studied by something that moved through the forest like a shadow but was decidedly not animal in nature. Rubbing his eyes, he closed the laptop and reached for his phone. A quick search showed the County Historical Society was located in the center of the small downtown area, housed in what had once been the original courthouse. If anyone knew the history of that section of forest and what might have existed there before it became federally protected land, they would. The drive into town took 20 minutes, the landscape transitioning from dense woods to scattered farmhouses, then to the modest collection of buildings that constituted the county seat. The Historical Society occupied a red brick building with white columns, its architecture a stark contrast to the utilitarian structures surrounding it. Inside, the air hung heavy with the scent of old paper and wood polish. Display cases showcased artifacts from the region's past, Native American arrowheads, logging tools, photographs of stern-faced settlers. The hunter approached the main desk, where an elderly woman with wire-rimmed glasses was meticulously cataloging a collection of faded photographs. "Good morning," the hunter said, keeping his voice appropriately hushed for the quiet space. "I'm doing some research on the northern section of the National Forest. Specifically, any structures or facilities that might have existed there before the land was federally designated." The archivist looked up, her gaze appraising him over the rims of her glasses. "Research for what purpose? Are you with the university?" "Personal interest," the hunter replied. "I'm staying in the area for a hunting trip. I came across something unusual yesterday, and I'm curious about its origins." The archivist's expression softened slightly at the mention of hunting, a familiar and respectable pursuit in these parts. "The northern section has quite a history. What specifically did you find? An old logging camp, perhaps?" "A cabin," the hunter said, deliberately keeping his description vague. "Seemed out of place." The archivist nodded, rising from her seat. "We have county land surveys dating back to the 1880s, Forest Service maps from when the area was first designated, and some materials from research projects conducted in the region." She gestured for him to follow. "This way to the archives." The back room contained rows of metal shelving units filled with acid-free boxes, bound volumes, and map cases. The archivist moved with practiced efficiency, selecting materials from various locations and placing them on a large wooden table in the center of the room. "These might be helpful," she said, opening a large format book containing land surveys. The northern section was primarily logging territory until the 1930s, then became part of a larger conservation effort. However, there was a period in the late 1940s through the mid-1960s when certain areas were leased to research organizations. The hunter leaned over the survey maps, scanning for anything in the vicinity of where he'd found the cabin. "What kind of research?" "Various projects," the archivist replied, pulling another box from the shelf. The university had several field stations for wildlife studies. There were also government contracts, mostly ecological monitoring, though some were classified at the time. She placed a thin folder on the table. "This might interest you. It's from a joint university government project called Terrestrial Adaptation Studies." They had several remote stations throughout the forest. The hunter opened the folder carefully. Inside were typewritten reports, facility diagrams, and a few black and white photographs of small research outposts, simple cabins with added laboratory spaces, not unlike what he'd discovered. These were established in 1953, the archivist continued, officially to study how various plant and animal species adapted to environmental changes. They were all supposedly decommissioned by 1964, and the structures were to be removed when the land reverted to Forest Service control. The hunter studied a map showing the locations of these research stations. One marker corresponded approximately to where he'd found the cabin. Were they all removed? According to official records, yes. The archivist's tone suggested otherwise. However, I've heard from hunters and hikers over the years that some remote structures still exist. The Forest Service likely determined it wasn't worth the resources to dismantle the more inaccessible ones. What else can you tell me about this terrestrial adaptation project? Who ran it? The archivist hesitated. That's where the records become vague. The university's biology department is listed as the principal investigator, but there are references to oversight by an agency called the Office of Scientific Intelligence. Not one I'm familiar with. She pulled another box from a different shelf. After the project officially ended, there were some unusual incidents reported in local newspapers. She removed a bound volume of newspaper clippings, primarily wildlife acting strangely, livestock disappearances, and a few hikers claiming they saw unusual things in the forest. The hunter felt a chill run down his spine. What kind of unusual things? Mostly described as tall, thin figures watching them from a distance. Most accounts were dismissed as wildlife sightings or overactive imaginations. She opened the bound volume to a marked page, except this one from 1968, which included a photograph. The newspaper clipping showed a blurry image taken in dense forest. In the background, partially obscured by trees, was a tall, unnaturally thin silhouette, remarkably similar to the figures in the photographs the hunter had found in the cabin. There was a brief investigation by local authorities, the archivist continued, but it was quickly shut down. The official explanation was that people were seeing injured or diseased elk standing on their hind legs. The incidents gradually faded from public attention, though they never entirely stopped. Even now, we get the occasional report. The hunter photographed the newspaper article with his phone, along with the maps showing research station locations. Is there anything else from that project? Any reports on what they were actually studying? The archivist shook her head. Most of the scientific documentation is either missing or was never deposited here. However, she hesitated, then lowered her voice. There is one more facility you might want to check. The project had an administrative center about 12 miles east of town, separate from the field stations. It was a larger complex where they supposedly processed specimens and analyzed data. After the project ended, it was abandoned rather than dismantled. Too costly to remove, I suppose. Is it still standing? Last I heard, yes, though it's been decades since anyone from the Historical Society visited. It's on what's now private property, technically off limits, but the owner, a reclusive type who inherited the land, doesn't maintain the boundaries well. She pulled out a current county map and marked a location with a pencil. If you're really interested in that cabin you found, this facility might provide more context. The hunter thanked the archivist for her assistance, gathering copies of the most relevant documents before departing. The morning had slipped into early afternoon, and dark clouds were gathering to the west, promising rain by evening. If he wanted to investigate this administrative center, he'd need to move quickly. Following the archivist's directions, he drove east out of town on a state highway before turning onto progressively narrower country roads. The final approach was a rutted dirt track that hadn't seen maintenance in years, forcing him to park and continue on foot through a tangle of second-growth forest and overgrown fields. After 15 minutes of hiking, the hunter emerged at the edge of a clearing dominated by a sprawling single-story concrete structure. Unlike the rustic cabin in the forest, this facility had been built with institutional efficiency, a long central corridor with wings extending at regular intervals, creating a layout reminiscent of a military installation or research hospital. Time had not been kind to the complex. The flat roof had collapsed in sections, allowing weather to penetrate and accelerate decay. Vegetation reclaimed the edges, with vines climbing the walls and saplings pushing through cracks in the concrete foundation. Windows were uniformly shattered, and one entire wing had partially collapsed. The hunter approached cautiously, alert for signs of recent human activity. Unlike the cabin, this facility showed no indications of recent visitation. No footprints in the accumulated leaf litter, no cleared pathways through the encroaching vegetation. Nature was steadily erasing this place from existence. The main entrance stood partially open, its heavy metal doors hanging askew from rusted hinges. The hunter paused in the doorway, listening. The only sounds were the distant rumble of thunder and the occasional drip of water from the compromised roof. He switched on his flashlight and stepped inside. The interior matched the institutional character of the exterior. Wide corridors with linoleum floors now buckled from moisture, doors labeled with faded numbers, bulletin boards still displaying the ghostly outlines of long-removed notices. The hunter moved slowly, documenting everything with his phone's camera. Most rooms contained only the skeletal remains of office furniture, metal desks consumed by rust, filing cabinets with drawers hanging open and empty, chairs reduced to frames after rodents had stripped their upholstery for nesting materials. One larger room appeared to have been a laboratory, with counters along the walls and plumbing fixtures protruding from the ceiling and floors. In what must have been the facility's administrative center, the hunter found a partial organizational chart still adhered to a wall, protected from the elements by its location in an interior room. Most names and positions had faded beyond recognition, but the project's title remained legible. Project Mimicry, Terrestrial Adaptation Studies Program. The word mimicry sent a jolt through the hunter. It matched a term used repeatedly in the journal he'd found in the cabin. A storage room at the end of the main corridor yielded the most significant discovery. A filing cabinet whose contents had been protected from moisture by a fallen section of ceiling tile. Inside were personnel files, most too water-damaged to read, but some technical documents remained legible. The hunter carefully photographed everything salvageable. One document particularly caught his attention, a technical brief titled Specimen Containment Protocols. The text described procedures for handling non-terrestrial biological entities with morphological plasticity and mimetic capabilities. The clinical language couldn't disguise the alarming implications. The research program had been studying something that could change its shape to resemble other organisms. As thunder crashed closer overhead and rain began to patter through the broken ceiling, the hunter gathered what documentation he could salvage and retreated from the decaying facility. The storm hit in full force as he reached his vehicle, the downpour reducing visibility to mere feet. During the drive back to his rental cabin, his mind raced with connections between what he'd found at the administrative center and the evidence in the forest cabin. The abandoned research program, the strange photographs, the journals describing something that mimicked rather than transformed, all pointed to something beyond conventional scientific understanding. What had started as a curious discovery during a hunting trip had evolved into something far more disturbing, the possible revelation of a decades-long attempt to study, and perhaps contain, something that should not exist in the natural world. The storm continued through the night, lashing the rental cabin with wind and rain. The hunter barely noticed, absorbed in organizing and analyzing the materials he'd gathered from the Historical Society, the administrative center, and the forest cabin. Sleep came in brief snatches between periods of intense focus. By morning, he had assembled a coherent timeline. The Terrestrial Adaptation Studies Program, or Project Mimicry, as it was apparently known internally, had operated from 1953 to 1964, studying an entity or entities with unusual biological properties. The program was officially terminated, but the evidence suggested monitoring had continued unofficially, with researchers periodically using the abandoned field stations to document ongoing activity. The most recent journal entries from the cabin indicated that whatever was being studied had become aware it was under observation and had begun actively countering these efforts. The researcher had fled when the entity started approaching the cabin at night. The hunter checked his weather app. The storm had passed, leaving behind clear skies but colder temperatures. Perfect conditions for returning to the forest cabin for a more thorough investigation. This time, he prepared methodically. In addition to his standard hunting gear, he packed extra batteries for his flashlight, a high-definition video camera, GPS locators, and plastic bags for collecting samples. After a moment's consideration, he added his sidearm, a Glock 20 he normally carried as protection against bears. Whatever was in those woods, he intended to be ready. The hike to the cabin seemed quicker this time, his feet finding the path with surprising ease despite having traveled it only once before. The forest felt different post-storm. The air crisp and clean, branches dripping with residual moisture. The ground softened to reveal tracks more clearly. The hunter paused at the forest's edge, surveying the clearing before the cabin. Something had changed. The frost-covered ground from his previous visit had been washed clean by the rain, revealing new patterns of movement. Multiple sets of tracks led to and from the cabin, all made after the storm. None resembled standard human or animal footprints. They were oddly spaced, asymmetrical, with varying depth and pressure patterns, as if whatever made them changed its weight distribution with each step. "I'm not alone," the hunter murmured, unholstering his sidearm and holding it ready at his side. He approached the cabin cautiously, following the wall rather than crossing directly through the clearing. At the corner nearest the front door, he knelt to examine the tracks more closely. They seemed to originate from multiple directions in the forest, converging at the cabin, then dispersing again. Like a meeting point, the cabin door now hung fully open, swinging slightly in the gentle breeze. The hunter recognized this as a change from his previous visit, when it had been partially closed. Someone, or something, had entered since his last visit. He paused at the threshold, listening intently. The cabin's interior was silent, but not with the dead quietude of abandonment. This was the alert silence of anticipation, like a breath held too long. "I know someone's been here," he called out, his voice steady. "I'm armed, and I'm coming inside." No response came from within. The hunter stepped through the doorway, weapon raised, sweeping the main room with practiced efficiency. Empty. The same disarray he'd left behind, though something felt subtly different. He couldn't immediately identify what had changed, but his hunter's instincts registered the disturbance. The journals and voice recorder he'd taken were obviously missing, but that was his doing. No, something else had been altered. He scanned the room carefully, comparing his mental image from the previous visit with what he now observed. The photographs above the fireplace, they'd been rearranged. Previously, they had been pinned haphazardly, without apparent organization. Now they formed a distinct pattern, the images creating a rough spiral with the clearest photo of the entity at the center. "A message," the hunter whispered, documenting the arrangement with his camera. He moved toward the rear addition, weapons still at the ready. The doorway seemed darker than before, the shadows within more concentrated. His flashlight beam penetrated only a few feet before being swallowed by the darkness. The hunter hesitated, then reached into his pack and removed a chemical light stick. He cracked it, activating the phosphorescent chemicals, and tossed it through the doorway. It landed on the floor of the back room, casting a sickly green glow that revealed the covered table and surrounding symbols. Something moved in the far corner, a shifting of shadows that didn't correspond with the light's gentle sway. The hunter raised his weapon. "Identify yourself," he commanded, using the authoritative tone that had served him well in confrontations with poachers and trespassers during his years in these woods. Only silence answered, but the shadow seemed to recede deeper into the corner, beyond the reach of the chemical light. The hunter stepped through the doorway, flashlight in one hand, weapon in the other. He swept the light toward the corner where he'd seen movement. Nothing was there, just the junction of two walls, empty of anything that could have created the shadow he'd observed. Keeping his guard up, the hunter approached the covered table. The tarp had been rearranged since his last visit, now folded back to reveal portions of the assembled bones. They had been reconfigured, the pieces rearranged into what appeared to be a more complete form, less a random collection and more an intentional reconstruction. More disturbing was the addition of new elements, fresh bones that still retained traces of tissue, arranged with the older specimens to fill gaps in the overall structure. Whatever this thing was meant to represent, it was now more complete than during his previous visit. The hunter photographed the modified assembly from multiple angles, then carefully examined the rest of the room. The desk in the corner had been cleared of the backpack and supplies he'd documented earlier. In their place sat a single item, a modern digital camera, not the one he'd seen on his first visit, but a newer model with professional-grade specifications. He approached cautiously and pressed the playback button. The screen illuminated, showing a series of photographs taken inside and around the cabin. The final images caused his breath to catch. They showed the hunter himself during his previous visit, photographed from outside the cabin as he examined the room. Someone had been watching him while he conducted his initial investigation. As he set the camera down, his flashlight beam caught something below the desk, a narrow gap between the floorboards, just wide enough to insert fingers. The hunter knelt and examined the seam, finding it too regular to be the result of natural warping or structural settling. Using his hunting knife, he carefully pried at the edge of one board. It lifted slightly, revealing a concealed latch mechanism. When triggered, a 2-foot square section of flooring hinged upward, exposing a dark space beneath. The hunter directed his flashlight into the opening. A ladder led downward into what appeared to be a continuation of the structure below ground level, a cellar or basement not visible from the exterior. This wasn't in any of the facility plans, he murmured, documenting the discovery with his camera. Decision time. Descending into an unknown space alone violated every safety protocol he'd learned through years of wilderness experience. Yet the prospect of leaving without investigating, only to return later and potentially find the entrance sealed or the evidence removed, seemed equally unacceptable. The hunter secured his weapon, adjusted his pack, and began the descent. The ladder was metal, bolted to a concrete shaft that extended about 8 feet below the cabin floor. At the bottom, a short concrete corridor led to a heavy metal door, the kind found in military installations or high-security research facilities, not rustic cabins. The door stood partially open, its locking mechanism apparently disabled. The hunter pushed it wider, revealing a space that contrasted sharply with the cabin above. This was a modern laboratory, with stainless steel counters, specialized equipment, and LED lighting that still functioned, powered by what must be an independent generator system. "What the hell?" the hunter whispered, stepping fully into the space. Unlike the weathered, abandoned appearance of the cabin, this underground facility showed signs of recent and regular use. Computer equipment hummed softly. Refrigeration units maintained samples at controlled temperatures. Notebooks contained data entries dated within the past month. The hunter moved through the space methodically, documenting everything. The laboratory appeared to focus on biological analysis, microscopes, centrifuges, and what looked like DNA sequencing equipment lined the counters. One section contained what might be environmental monitoring systems, with screens displaying real-time data from what appeared to be sensors distributed throughout the surrounding forest. On a central workstation, a laptop computer sat open, its screen showing a password prompt. Next to it lay a leather-bound journal, different from those the hunter had found previously. This one contained entries in a crisp, professional hand, detailing observations of the specimen with clinical detachment. The most recent entry, dated just 2 days earlier, read, "Subject continues to display advancing mimetic capabilities. Latest tissue samples show cellular structure increasingly indistinguishable from target organism DNA. Containment protocols may be inadequate if current development trajectory continues. Recommend full facility lockdown pending consultation with central authority." The hunter photographed every page of the journal, then continued his exploration of the underground facility. A door at the rear of the laboratory led to a short hallway with 3 additional rooms. The first contained bunk beds and personal storage lockers, living quarters for researchers during extended observation periods. The second was set up as a secure communications center, with satellite uplink equipment and encrypted radio systems. The third room was sealed with a heavier door than the others, featuring multiple locking mechanisms and a biometric scanner. A sign on the door read simply, "Containment, Level 4 authorization required." Unlike the laboratory entrance, this door was securely locked. Through a small observation window, the hunter could see a space resembling a medical isolation room, white walls, sealed ventilation systems, and what appeared to be a large cylindrical tank or chamber in the center. Whatever the researchers had been studying, whatever had created those strange tracks around the cabin, this was apparently where they kept it, at least periodically. The implication that it might no longer be contained sent a shiver down the hunter's spine. He completed his documentation of the underground facility, then returned to the ladder. As he climbed back toward the cabin, a subtle vibration ran through the metal rungs. At first he attributed it to the generator systems, but as the sensation intensified, he realized it was something else. Footsteps moving across the cabin floor above. Someone had entered while he was below ground. The hunter froze on the ladder, his breath shallow and controlled. The footsteps above were irregular, not the confident stride of a Forest Service ranger or the cautious approach of another hunter. The cadence was wrong, the weight distribution shifting unpredictably, like someone learning to walk, or something approximating human movement without fully understanding it. Carefully, he reached for his sidearm, ensuring it was accessible. Then, with deliberate slowness, he continued up the final rungs, pausing just below the floor level. From this position, he could see into the back room of the cabin but remained mostly concealed. The space appeared empty at first glance, but a shadow moved across the far wall, a distortion of shape that matched no obvious source. The hunter held his position, waiting. The shadow passed again, more defined now, elongated and angular, in ways that defied normal human proportions. A soft sound reached his ears, a rhythmic clicking, like mandibles or chitinous appendages striking together. It originated from the main room of the cabin, growing gradually closer to the doorway connecting the two spaces. The hunter weighed his options. Confrontation in such a confined space was risky. Retreat back to the underground facility might trap him if the trapdoor was closed. Observation seemed the most prudent course until he better understood what he was facing. A form appeared in the doorway between the two rooms, a silhouette that superficially resembled a human but was wrong in critical ways. Too tall, too thin, with joints that bent at unnatural angles. It paused at the threshold, head turning in a mechanical sweep of the room, movements reminiscent of an insect, despite its roughly humanoid shape. The hunter remained motionless, controlling his breathing, a skill honed through countless hours of stalking wary deer. The creature, for he could not think of it as human, completed its survey of the visible space and stepped fully into the back room. Its body appeared to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating the impression of a three-dimensional void moving through space. As it approached the covered table with its assembly of bones, the hunter carefully raised his phone and activated the video function. Whatever happened next, he would have documentation. The creature extended what might be called arms, though they terminated in appendages unlike human hands, more articulated, with too many joints. It removed the covering entirely from the bone assembly, revealing the complete structure. In the green glow of the chemical light, the hunter could now see that what he'd taken for a random collection was actually a coherent whole, a skeletal framework for something that resembled the creature itself, as if it were building a version of its own internal structure from available materials. The creature made a sound, not speech, but not entirely unlike it, a series of modulated vibrations that seemed to carry information. It reached toward the bone assembly and adjusted several pieces, then turned suddenly toward the open trapdoor. The hunter ducked lower, but not before the creature's attention fixed on the opening. It moved with startling speed, crossing the room in a single fluid motion that defied physics. The hunter abandoned stealth and scrambled up the remaining rungs, drawing his weapon as he emerged into the cabin. The creature loomed above him, its form seeming to shift and flow even as he focused on it, where a face should be, features constantly rearranged, as if cycling through possibilities without settling on a final configuration. The effect was profoundly disturbing, triggering a primal fear response the hunter had never experienced even when confronting wounded predators. "Stay back," he ordered, weapon raised. The creature paused, head tilting at an impossible angle. Then it produced sounds again, closer to human speech this time, but distorted, as if assembled from fragments of recorded conversations. "Observer? Not authorized. Containment protocol. Active." The hunter maintained his aim. "What are you?" The creature's form rippled, briefly taking on a more defined humanoid appearance before dissolving back into its fluid state. "We adapt, study, reciprocal." A chill ran down the hunter's spine as understanding dawned. This thing wasn't just the subject of research. It was conducting its own investigation, studying humans just as they studied it. "Are you alone?" the hunter asked, backing slowly toward the cabin's front door. The creature's response was a sound like laughter fractured through a broken speaker. "Never. Alone. Colony. Expanding." The implication struck the hunter with the force of a physical blow. Not one entity, but many. A colony. Expanding. Before he could formulate another question, the creature lunged forward with that same impossible speed. The hunter fired once, the report deafeningly loud in the confined space. The bullet passed through the creature's form without apparent effect, striking the wall behind it. The hunter turned and ran, bursting through the front door into the clearing. He sprinted for the forest edge, expecting at any moment to feel the creature's grasp. But when he reached the tree line and looked back, the cabin stood silent, the creature nowhere to be seen. Heart pounding, weapon still ready, the hunter circled wide through the forest until he reached his original approach path. He maintained a rapid pace back to his vehicle, constantly scanning for pursuit that never materialized. The drive to town passed in a blur of adrenaline and racing thoughts. The county sheriff's office was his destination, despite his previous dismissive reception. This evidence, video of the creature, documentation of the underground facility, was too substantial to ignore. The same deputy was on duty, his expression shifting from boredom to recognition as the hunter approached the desk. Back again? Find more mysterious bones? The deputy's tone was light, but his eyes betrayed caution. I have video, the hunter said without preamble, placing his phone on the counter, of what's in that cabin, and documentation of an underground research facility that's still active. The deputy's smile faded. He glanced around the empty office, then leaned forward. Put that away, he said quietly. What? I said put it away. You don't want to show that to anyone here. The hunter studied the deputy's face, noting the fear that had replaced the previous skepticism. You know something. The deputy straightened, his official manner returning. Sir, I've filed your previous report as requested. If you have additional concerns about unauthorized structures on federal land, you should contact the Forest Service during regular business hours. But as the hunter turned to leave, the deputy added in a near whisper, County parking lot, 20 minutes. The hunter nodded almost imperceptibly and departed. He spent the intervening time in his vehicle, organizing his evidence on his laptop and creating backups on multiple devices. Whatever happened next, he would ensure this information survived. 20 minutes later, the deputy appeared at the edge of the parking lot, now in civilian clothes. He approached the hunter's vehicle and slipped into the passenger seat without a word. Drive, he instructed. Anywhere, just get us away from the station. The hunter complied, heading toward the outskirts of town. Once they were beyond the main streets, the deputy visibly relaxed. You're not the first, he said without preamble. Every few years, someone stumbles across one of those facilities or sees something in the forest they can't explain. Most convince themselves they were mistaken. Those who don't usually leave town suddenly. You believe me, the hunter observed. The deputy, or former deputy as he now appeared, nodded. My grandfather worked security for that research program in the 60s. He didn't talk about it much, but near the end, when the dementia took hold, he couldn't stop talking about the things that wear people like suits. Said they escaped containment in '64. That's why the program officially shut down. But someone's still studying them. That facility under the cabin is modern, actively used. Different organization now. Private, not government. The sheriff and several county officials are on their payroll. Consulting fees for ignoring certain activities in the forest and discouraging public interest. The deputy ran a hand through his hair. I've been documenting the connections for months, building a case. Why are you telling me this? Because you have what I don't, direct evidence, and because by this time tomorrow I'll probably be fired or worse. They monitor the station cameras. They'll know I spoke to you. He pulled a small notebook from his pocket. This journalist has been investigating similar phenomena in other locations. She's careful, credible, and most importantly, has contacts in federal oversight agencies that aren't compromised. The hunter took the offered information, recognizing it as a valuable alliance. What will you do now? Leave town. Continue my investigation from somewhere safer. The deputy opened the car door. If you're smart, you'll do the same. These things, whatever they are, have been establishing themselves here for decades. They have human collaborators, and they know you've seen them now. After dropping the deputy at a bus station outside town, the hunter returned to his rental cabin. As he turned into the driveway, he immediately noticed something wrong. The door stood slightly ajar, though he was certain he'd locked it before leaving. Weapon drawn, he approached cautiously. No signs of forced entry were visible. Inside, nothing appeared disturbed at first glance, but as he moved through the space, subtle wrongness emerged. His laptop had been moved slightly on the table. A chair was positioned at a different angle. The faint scent of something chemical yet organic lingered in the air. On the kitchen counter, a note had been left, not handwritten, but composed of letters cut from magazines and newspapers, arranged with mechanical precision. Observers are observed. Hunters become hunted. Leave or join the specimens. The hunter photographed the note, then methodically searched the entire cabin for additional intrusions or surveillance devices. Finding none, he began packing his belongings. The deputy's warning echoed in his mind. These entities had established themselves deeply in this region, with human cooperation at multiple levels. At his laptop, he organized all evidence, photographs, videos, journal entries, facility documentation, and encrypted the files before sending copies to multiple secure cloud storage locations. He then composed a detailed email to the journalist whose information the deputy had provided, attaching key evidence and requesting an urgent meeting. As night fell, the hunter completed his preparations. He would depart before dawn, but not to flee. The journalist had agreed to meet him in Minneapolis the following afternoon. From there, they would approach federal authorities together, bypassing local officials entirely. What had begun as a curious discovery in the forest had evolved into something much larger, evidence of non-terrestrial biological entities establishing themselves in remote wilderness areas, studied in secret for decades, now apparently expanding their presence with the aid of human collaborators. The hunter checked his weapon one final time before setting it on the bedside table, but he marked him as a threat. The hunter had become the hunted, but he had survived in these forests for nearly 20 years because he understood a fundamental truth. Even apex predators had vulnerabilities. Whatever these entities were, whatever their capabilities or intentions, they could be studied, understood, and if necessary, stopped. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of that pursuit, not for trophies or sustenance, but for answers, accountability, and the protection of an unsuspecting public. The hunter closed his eyes, his breathing steadying into the calm rhythm of a predator at rest, gathering strength for the challenge ahead. Dawn had not yet broken when the hunter loaded the last of his gear into his truck. The forest surrounding the rental cabin remained shrouded in darkness, the kind of absolute black that exists only in places far removed from civilization's constant illumination. He worked by the narrow beam of a headlamp, movements economical and precise, checking and double-checking that nothing essential was left behind. Inside, spread across the kitchen table, lay copies of the documentation he'd assembled, photographs of the cabin and its underground laboratory, journal entries detailing decades of research into the entities, maps showing facility locations throughout the national forest, and the video of his encounter with the creature. Next to these materials sat a sealed envelope addressed to his former hunting partner, a man who had shared countless expeditions with him over the years and would recognize the gravity of what the package contained. The hunter recorded a final video on his phone, speaking directly to the camera with the measured cadence that characterized all his communications. "If you're watching this, I didn't make it to Minneapolis," he began, his weathered face illuminated by the kitchen light. "In the attached files, you'll find evidence of something operating in the northern section of the forest, something non-human that can take human form. Local authorities are compromised. The sheriff's department is involved. Contact the journalist whose information is included here. She's expecting me today. Tell her what happened." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "To my children, I'm sorry. What I've discovered here needs to be exposed, no matter the risk. Your mother will take care of you." Another pause. "The location data for all the facilities I've found is in the encrypted file. The password is the name of the first buck I helped you take down," a reference his son would understand immediately. The hunter ended the recording and transferred it to multiple secure cloud storage locations, setting delayed release protocols that would automatically send the information to pre-selected recipients if he failed to deactivate them within 24 hours. Redundancy was essential. If something happened to him, the evidence would still reach the public. He sent a text message to his former brother-in-law, a commercial pilot whose job kept him traveling extensively, a man with no connection to this region who could be trusted to handle the physical evidence package if necessary. The message was brief. "Hunting trip extended. Package at usual drop might need forwarding. We'll call by tomorrow afternoon." A prearranged code indicating the package contained something of critical importance. The hunter performed a final sweep of the cabin, ensuring no trace of his research remained. He'd already wiped down surfaces, removing fingerprints and other forensic evidence. If the entities or their human collaborators investigated after his departure, they would find nothing to indicate where he had gone or who he had contacted. His sidearm was secured in its holster, loaded with a full magazine plus one in the chamber. 2 spare magazines were positioned for quick access. Though the Glock had proven ineffective against the creature in the cabin, the bullet passing through its form without apparent effect, it might still prove useful against human threats. In addition to his usual gear, the hunter carried specialized equipment acquired during his military service decades earlier. Items that existed in a gray area of legality but which experience had taught him might mean the difference between survival and capture. A military-grade GPS jammer could disrupt tracking efforts. A thermal imaging scope might reveal entities that conventional vision would miss. Smoke and flash grenades could provide cover if escape became necessary. The hunter checked his watch. 5:17 a.m. His meeting with the journalist was scheduled for 2 p.m. in Minneapolis, roughly 4 hours' drive from his current location. The timing allowed for a significant buffer in case of complications or pursuit. He had plotted 3 alternate routes, each avoiding major highways where traffic cameras might track his movement. Before leaving, he stood at the cabin's threshold for a long moment, scanning the tree line with experienced eyes. Nothing moved in the pre-dawn stillness, yet he couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. The hunter had survived nearly 2 decades in these forests by trusting his instincts, and every instinct now screamed danger. "I know you're out there," he murmured, voice barely audible even to himself. "But you're not the only one who can hunt." He locked the door behind him, climbed into his truck, and started the engine. As the headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the narrow dirt road leading away from the cabin, he noticed something that hadn't been there the previous evening. A series of strange markings gouged into the dirt, forming patterns similar to those he'd seen surrounding the bone assembly in the cabin. A message, a warning. The entities knew he was leaving and wanted him to know they were aware. The hunter shifted into drive and accelerated away from the cabin, leaving the markings and whatever had created them behind, for now. As he navigated the winding forest roads, his mind remained clear, focused on the task ahead. He would deliver the evidence, expose the truth, and ensure that whatever these entities were, whatever their purpose in establishing themselves here, they would no longer operate in secrecy. The eastern horizon had just begun to lighten, the first tentative glow of sunrise transforming the black silhouettes of pine trees to deep blue, when the hunter made a decision that diverged from his carefully constructed plan. Instead of taking the most direct route toward Minneapolis, he turned onto a smaller road heading north, toward the location the archivist had marked as the primary research facility for Project Mimicry, the administrative hub that would have coordinated all the smaller outposts like the cabin he'd discovered. One final investigation before leaving the area. One last piece of evidence that might prove decisive. The timing was calculated. Early morning when human activity would be minimal, but with sufficient light for documentation. A brief reconnaissance only. Nothing that would significantly delay his journey to Minneapolis. If the facility revealed nothing of value, he would simply continue on his way. If it yielded critical information, the risk would be justified. The hunter set his jaw with determination as the truck climbed a steep incline, headlights illuminating a sign partially obscured by vegetation. Government property, no trespassing, authorized personnel only. Beyond the sign, a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire extended into the forest in both directions. The main gate, which should have been secured, hung partially open, not damaged or forced, but deliberately left accessible. Recent tire tracks cut through the layer of fallen pine needles covering the access road beyond. Someone had been here recently. Someone was perhaps still here. The hunter pulled his truck to the side of the road, concealing it behind a dense stand of pines where it wouldn't be visible from either direction. He gathered his essential gear, sidearm, camera, flashlight, GPS unit, and the military equipment, and proceeded on foot, moving with the silent efficiency that had made him a successful hunter for nearly 2 decades. The access road beyond the gate showed signs of regular use despite the facility's supposedly abandoned status. The hunter followed it for approximately half a mile before the trees opened to reveal a clearing dominated by a complex far larger and more modern than he had anticipated. Unlike the decaying administrative center he'd explored previously, this facility appeared operational and well-maintained. The main structure was a 2-story concrete building with few windows, surrounded by smaller outbuildings and what appeared to be disguised ventilation systems protruding from the ground at regular intervals. A communications array occupied the roof, featuring satellite uplinks and microwave transmission dishes. The entire complex was surrounded by a secondary security fence with electronic monitoring systems. Most concerning were the vehicles parked in a designated area near the main entrance, 3 black SUVs with government plates, and a larger transport truck with no markings. Light glowed from windows on the ground floor, indicating active occupation. The hunter retreated to the tree line, considering his options. Direct approach was impossible without detection. The security systems were likely to include motion sensors and cameras. However, the facility's very existence contradicted official records claiming all Project Mimicry installations had been decommissioned decades ago. Documentation of this active site, even from a distance, would provide crucial corroborating evidence for his other discoveries. Using the cover of the forest, he circled the perimeter, maintaining distance from the security fence while photographing the facility from multiple angles. The zoom lens on his camera captured details of the security systems, the government vehicles, and personnel moving between buildings, men and women in what appeared to be standard research attire, white lab coats over casual clothing. As the hunter completed his circuit of the facility, he identified what appeared to be a maintenance access point in the perimeter fence, a section where the electronic monitoring system was temporarily disabled, marked by the absence of indicator lights that glowed at regular intervals along other sections. A work crew had apparently been conducting repairs or modifications and had yet to reactivate that segment of the security system. A potential entry point, if he chose to risk closer investigation. The hunter checked his watch, 6:45 a.m. His meeting in Minneapolis remained hours away, sufficient time for a limited infiltration to document what lay inside. Decision made, he moved toward the access point, staying low and using natural cover whenever possible. The morning mist still clung to the ground, providing additional concealment as he approached the fence. The disabled section was secured only by a simple padlock, which he bypassed using skills acquired during specialized training years earlier. Once through the perimeter fence, the hunter moved rapidly to the nearest outbuilding, using it as cover while surveying the main facility entrance. 2 guards stood watch, armed with standard-issue sidearms and what appeared to be tactical communications equipment. Their stance and vigilance suggested professional security training, likely military or federal law enforcement background. Direct entry through the main doors was impossible. However, a loading dock on the building's eastern side showed less activity. The hunter documented the security layout, then made his approach, timing his movements to coincide with the guards' regular patrol patterns. The loading dock door was secured electronically, but a nearby emergency exit relied on a physical lock mechanism that proved vulnerable to the hunter's infiltration tools. Within minutes, he had gained access to the facility's interior, a service corridor that appeared to connect the loading dock to the main sections of the building. The hunter moved cautiously, documenting everything with his camera. Unlike the abandoned administrative center or the hidden laboratory beneath the cabin, this facility was clearly a major operation, well-funded, professionally staffed, and actively engaged in ongoing research. Placards on doors identified various departments: biological research, morphological analysis, containment systems, field operations. Most doors were secured with keycard access systems beyond his ability to bypass without detection. However, one laboratory at the end of the corridor had been left accessible, its door propped slightly open by a cart positioned in the threshold. From within came the soft hum of operating equipment and the occasional clink of laboratory glassware. The hunter approached silently, positioning himself to peer through the gap without being seen. What he witnessed inside caused his blood to run cold. The laboratory contained 6 transparent containment chambers, arranged in a circular pattern, each connected to monitoring equipment and environmental control systems. 5 chambers stood empty. The 6th contained what initially appeared to be a human male in a medical gown, seated on a simple bench, face obscured by long hair. 2 researchers in biohazard suits moved around the chamber, adjusting equipment and taking readings. Their voices were muffled by their protective gear, but their body language conveyed professional detachment as they studied the figure inside the containment unit. Subject 37 displays advanced integration of acquired morphological characteristics. One researcher dictated into a recording device. Cellular stability has improved by 64% compared to previous specimens. Mimetic fidelity now approaches 97% under controlled conditions, with deterioration occurring only after extended periods without molecular recalibration. The second researcher approached the chamber, pressing a button on a control panel. Subject 37, please demonstrate current morphological range. The figure inside raised its head slowly, and the hunter had to suppress a gasp of shock. What had appeared human from a distance revealed itself as a grotesque approximation upon closer inspection. The facial features were asymmetrical, with proportions that shifted subtly even as he watched. The eyes contained no discernible irises, just expanding and contracting pupils that seemed to fill the entire visible surface. At the researcher's request, the entity began to transform. The process was neither instant nor fluid, but rather a disturbing reconfiguration of physical matter. Bones visibly shifted beneath skin that stretched and contracted. Facial features dissolved and reformed. Height increased by nearly 12 inches as the spine elongated. Most disturbing was the sound, a wet, crackling noise like ice breaking on a frozen lake, accompanied by what might have been expressions of pain if such concepts applied to this creature. Within approximately 2 minutes, the entity had transformed from its human approximation to the tall, thin form the hunter had encountered in the cabin, the form captured in the photographs pinned above the fireplace. This appeared to be its natural state, or at least a form it could maintain with less effort than the human mimicry. Transformation sequence complete, the first researcher noted. Time to full morphological shift, 1 minute 47 seconds. Significant improvement over previous trials. The second researcher made an adjustment to the control panel. Subject 37, please return to baseline human configuration, variant 3. The entity began another transformation, this time taking the form of a female human, approximately 30 years of age. The process was similar but seemed to require more effort, with multiple features forming incorrectly before being adjusted. The researchers documented each aspect of the transformation meticulously. Opposite sex mimicry still presents challenges, the first researcher observed. Hormone simulation and secondary sex characteristic formation remain inconsistent. Recommend continued cellular programming with additional female genetic templates. The hunter documented the entire sequence with his camera, ensuring the video captured both the entity's transformations and the researcher's commentary. This was definitive proof, not just of the entity's existence, but of an organized, government-sanctioned program studying and potentially developing their capabilities. As he adjusted position to capture a better angle, his elbow contacted a metal cart in the hallway, causing a barely perceptible sound. Inside the laboratory, the entity's head snapped toward the door with inhuman speed, its not quite human eyes focusing directly on the hunter's position despite the minimal visibility through the partially open door. A sound emerged from the entity. Not speech, but a high-pitched keening that caused the monitoring equipment in the laboratory to fluctuate wildly. The researchers turned toward the door, alerted by both the entity's reaction and the equipment anomalies. Security breach, one researcher said calmly into a communication device. East Corridor, Section C. Possible observation of Subject 37 trial. The hunter abandoned stealth and moved rapidly back toward the emergency exit through which he had entered. Before he could reach it, an alarm activated throughout the facility. Not a blaring siren, but a pulsing tone, accompanied by flashing amber lights recessed into the corridor ceiling. Ahead, a security door began to descend, threatening to cut off his escape route. The hunter accelerated to a sprint, sliding beneath the descending door with inches to spare. Behind him, he could hear the rapid footfalls of security personnel responding to the breach. He reached the emergency exit and burst through it into the morning light, immediately cutting toward the forest rather than following the access road. As he cleared the perimeter fence through the maintenance access point, shouted commands echoed from the facility. The hunter didn't look back, focusing entirely on putting distance between himself and his pursuers. His familiarity with forest movement became his primary advantage. The ability to navigate dense undergrowth at speed while maintaining awareness of direction and potential obstacles. The sound of vehicles starting reached him as he entered the tree line. The security team would likely attempt to cut him off, rather than pursue directly through the forest. His truck, hidden a half-mile away, might already be compromised. The hunter adjusted his route, moving perpendicular to the access road rather than parallel to it. The terrain grew steeper, forcing him to scramble up rocky inclines and navigate between closely spaced trees. His breathing remained controlled, his movements precise despite the urgency. This was familiar. The forest had been his domain for decades. Behind him, crashing sounds indicated less experienced pursuers attempting to follow his path through the undergrowth. He estimated at least 3 individuals, likely security personnel rather than researchers. Their movements lacked the woodcraft that came from years spent hunting these forests. The hunter reached a small stream and waded upstream for 50 yards before exiting on a rocky bank that would leave minimal tracks. A technique he'd employed countless times when stalking particularly wary deer. He continued at a diagonal to his original path, doubling back toward where he had concealed his vehicle but from a different direction than his pursuers would anticipate. As he navigated through a particularly dense thicket, movement to his left caught his peripheral vision. He froze, becoming part of the forest landscape through absolute stillness. Another hunting skill deployed for self-preservation rather than pursuit. 20 yards away, something moved through the forest that matched neither the methodical progress of the security personnel nor the natural movement of wildlife. It traversed the space between trees with that same unsettling fluidity he had witnessed in the cabin. the entity's tall, thin form briefly visible before disappearing behind a large pine. The hunter remained motionless, controlling his breathing to near imperceptibility. The entity paused, its form becoming still in a way that suggested sensory assessment rather than indecision. It appeared to be searching, filtering the forest for signs of his passage. For nearly 2 minutes, hunter and entity remained locked in this silent standoff, neither moving, each aware of the other's presence but unable to pinpoint exact location. Then, mercifully, shouts from the security team drew the entity's attention. It turned toward the sound with that unnaturally fluid motion and moved away, apparently prioritizing coordination with the human security forces over independent search. The hunter allowed himself 3 deep breaths, then continued his circuitous route back toward his concealed vehicle. The sounds of pursuit gradually faded as the search expanded in the wrong direction. His knowledge of the forest had provided the advantage he needed. When he finally reached the stand of pines where he had hidden his truck, the hunter approached with extreme caution, scanning for any sign of an ambush. Finding none, he quickly checked the vehicle for tracking devices or tampering, then slipped inside and started the engine. Rather than returning to the main road immediately, he followed a series of logging tracks that circumvented the facility's access road entirely, eventually connecting with a fire service route that would lead back to the state highway system. Only when he had put 10 miles between himself and the facility did he allow himself to fully process what he had witnessed. The entities were not simply being studied, they were being developed, refined, perhaps even weaponized. The researchers had referred to improvement over previous trials and cellular programming, suggesting deliberate enhancement of the creature's mimetic abilities. Most disturbing was the entity's designation, Subject 37, implying at least 36 previous specimens had been processed through this facility. The hunter checked his secure digital storage, confirming that the video documentation had been automatically uploaded to his encrypted cloud locations. The evidence was preserved, regardless of what might happen to him now. He set course for Minneapolis, pushing his vehicle to the limit of safety on the rural highways, constantly checking his mirrors for signs of pursuit. By 11:30 a.m., he had reached the outskirts of Minneapolis, having taken a circuitous route that added nearly an hour to the journey, but minimized his exposure to traffic cameras and potential interception. The urban environment offered both risk and safety, more surveillance, but also more witnesses and public scrutiny that might deter direct action against him. The hunter found a busy shopping center parking lot and positioned his vehicle where it would be surrounded by others, making any approach obvious. He transferred essential evidence to a nondescript backpack, secured his weapon where it remained accessible but concealed, and sent a text message to the journalist requesting confirmation of their meeting. The response came within minutes. Still on for 2 p.m., same location, come alone. The hunter settled in to wait, maintaining vigilant observation of his surroundings. The evidence he carried would change everything, not just exposing the existence of these entities, but revealing a decades-long government program developing their abilities for unknown purposes. The public deserved to know the truth, whatever the cost to himself might be. The cafe occupied the ground floor of a renovated warehouse in downtown Minneapolis, its industrial aesthetic and abundant windows making it popular with the city's journalists and creative professionals. The hunter arrived 20 minutes early, selecting a table with clear sightlines to all entrances and minimal exposure to his back. He ordered coffee he didn't intend to drink and maintained constant awareness of everyone who entered. The journalist arrived precisely at 2 p.m., a woman in her early 40s with the alert eyes and careful movements of someone accustomed to handling sensitive information. She carried a leather messenger bag and scanned the cafe methodically before approaching his table. No introductions were exchanged. The deputy's recommendation had established sufficient preliminary trust. "You have evidence?" she asked, sliding into the seat opposite him, positioning herself to observe the main entrance. The hunter nodded, keeping his voice low. "Video documentation of non-terrestrial biological entities capable of mimicking human form, and evidence of a government research program developing their capabilities." The journalist's expression remained neutral, but her eyes sharpened with interest. "Show me." The hunter placed his phone on the table, angled so only she could view the screen, and played the video he had captured in the facility laboratory. He watched her face as she observed the entity's transformation from human approximation to its natural state, and back to a different human form. Her professional composure cracked briefly, eyes widening at the most disturbing moments of the metamorphosis. "There's more," he said when the video ended, transferring additional files to her device through an encrypted connection. Photographs, journal entries documenting decades of research, maps of facilities throughout the northern forest. The underground laboratory was still active, still studying these things. The journalist reviewed the materials with methodical thoroughness, asking precise questions about locations, timestamps, and the chain of evidence. "This is beyond anything I've encountered," she finally admitted. "You understand what this means? That's why I'm here. This needs to be exposed, immediately and widely enough that it can't be contained or dismissed." She nodded, already formulating strategy. "I have contacts at 3 national news organizations who can verify and publish simultaneously, and connections with oversight committees in Washington who won't be compromised by whoever is running this program." She looked up from the files. "Once this goes public, your life changes forever. There will be people who want to discredit you, silence you, or worse. I've considered that. The evidence speaks for itself." "It does." The journalist closed her device and leaned forward. "Here's what happens next. I'm taking this to my editor and my verification team today. By tomorrow morning, it goes to my contacts at the other networks. We publish simultaneously across multiple platforms within 48 hours, coordinated with formal requests for investigation from congressional oversight committees." The hunter nodded. "And my role? Stay somewhere secure but accessible. Once this breaks, every news organization in the country will want your first-hand account." She reached into her bag and removed a burner phone. "Use this for contact. Your personal devices are likely compromised already." Their meeting concluded with exchange of emergency protocols and contingency plans. The journalist departed first, taking separate transportation as a security measure. The hunter remained at the cafe for another 30 minutes before leaving, constantly vigilant for surveillance or pursuit. For the next 48 hours, he maintained a low profile in a nondescript hotel outside Minneapolis, venturing out only for necessities and maintaining regular contact with the journalist through the secure device she had provided. The evidence underwent rigorous verification by technical experts, corroborating documentation was assembled, and publication strategy was finalized. At 6 a.m. on the third day after their meeting, the story broke simultaneously across 3 major news networks, 5 international publications, and dozens of digital platforms. The hunter watched from his hotel room as the carefully edited footage he had captured played on every channel, accompanied by documentation of the decades-long research program and its apparent purpose. Shocking discovery: non-human entities living among us. Government secret: Project Mimicry exposed. Whistleblower reveals creatures that can take human form. Within hours, social media exploded with reaction, analysis, and speculation. By mid-morning, congressional leaders had called emergency sessions to address the revelations. The Pentagon issued a carefully worded statement, neither confirming nor denying the existence of the program, but announcing an immediate investigation into unauthorized research activities at the facility. By afternoon, helicopter footage showed a massive response at the research facility. FBI vehicles, military personnel, and what appeared to be specialized containment units surrounding the complex. The northern Minnesota forest had become the focus of the largest federal operation in recent history. The journalist contacted the hunter through their secure channel. "It's happening. Multiple agencies are involved now, operating independently to prevent containment or cover-up. They've already secured 3 additional facilities based on the maps you provided." "And the entities?" "Several have been contained. Others apparently escaped during the initial response. The military has established a perimeter around the entire region." A pause. "You should know. They found evidence of infiltration at high levels. Officials who appeared human but weren't. The extent is still being determined. The implications were staggering. Not just research on these entities, but active infiltration of human society, potentially for decades." Everything the hunter had discovered, from the abandoned cabin to the underground laboratory to the research facility, represented only the visible portion of something far larger and more disturbing. 3 days after the story broke, the hunter stood on the shore of a lake 30 miles from the forest where his discovery had begun. Behind him, his packed truck contained the essentials for extended travel. The journalist had arranged for his testimony to be recorded and verified by federal investigators at a secure location, after which he would be free to disappear for his own safety. On the horizon, military helicopters traversed the sky above the national forest, part of the ongoing operation to locate and contain any remaining entities. News reports indicated that the investigation had expanded to multiple states, with specialized teams examining suspicious reports dating back decades. The hunter watched this activity with mixed emotions: satisfaction that the truth had been exposed, concern for what might yet be discovered, and a deep weariness born from his direct confrontation with something beyond conventional understanding. His life as he had known it was over. His identity was now irrevocably linked to this discovery. He thought of his children, now under protection at an undisclosed location, and the world they would inherit, a world forever changed by the knowledge that humanity was not alone, that entities existed capable of mimicking human form almost perfectly, and that these entities had been among them, undetected, for years. As the sun began to set over the lake, casting long shadows across the water, the hunter allowed himself a moment of reflection. He had entered those woods as he had hundreds of times before, expecting nothing more than the familiar pursuit of deer through terrain he knew intimately. Instead, he had discovered something that shattered humanity's understanding of its place in the universe. "I did what needed to be done," he said to the empty air, words carried away by the gentle breeze across the lake. Then, with a final glance toward the forest that had changed everything, he turned and walked to his truck. The hunter had completed his most important hunt, not for game, but for truth, and though the personal cost had been enormous, he knew with absolute certainty that he would make the same choice again. Some discoveries once made demanded exposure, whatever the consequences might be. As he drove away from the lake, away from the forest and everything familiar, the hunter felt a strange sense of peace beneath the uncertainty. He had faced something beyond human comprehension, and had emerged with his humanity not just intact, but affirmed. In exposing the entities, he had performed perhaps the most human act possible, insisting on truth in the face of the unknown. The road ahead stretched into gathering darkness, but for the first time since entering that abandoned cabin, the hunter moved forward without looking back. 6 months had passed since the hunter's discovery had shattered the world's understanding of what existed in the shadows. Winter had released its grip on northern Minnesota, giving way to the tentative green of early spring. The hunter stood at the perimeter of what had once been the main research facility, now transformed into the epicenter of the largest joint federal investigation in American history. The chain-link fence had been replaced with a military-grade security system, motion sensors, surveillance cameras, and armed personnel stationed at regular intervals. Beyond the fence, temporary structures had been erected to house the various agencies involved in the ongoing operation: FBI evidence response teams, CDC containment units, Department of Defense research divisions, and specialized task forces created specifically to address what the media had dubbed the infiltration crisis. The hunter presented his credentials, a special consultant badge issued by a joint congressional oversight committee, and was escorted through multiple security checkpoints by a stone-faced agent who spoke only to verify identity and clearance levels. The hunter's testimony had been so crucial to the initial exposure that he had been granted unprecedented access to the investigation, though always under strict supervision. Inside the main facility, which had been expanded significantly since his covert entry 6 months earlier, the hunter was led to a secure briefing room where the operations leadership had assembled for their weekly status update. Representatives from each federal agency sat around a conference table, accompanied by scientific advisors and security specialists. At the head of the table, the FBI special agent in charge nodded in acknowledgement as the hunter took a seat near the back. "As our key witness is now present, we can begin the briefing," the special agent announced, activating a secure display screen at the front of the room. First, the containment statistics. To date, we have confirmed and secured 67 individual entities across 14 states. 42 were found in human form, integrated into various communities and institutions. 12 were discovered in transitional states, apparently attempting to perfect their mimicry. The remainder were in what we believe to be their natural form. The screen displayed a map showing concentration patterns primarily centered around rural areas adjacent to national forests and parks across the northern United States, with secondary clusters near certain military installations and research facilities. Forensic analysis has established a timeline of infiltration dating back to at least 1947, with significant acceleration beginning in the early 1960s, continued the special agent. Project Mimicry, which began as a legitimate research program studying a single captured entity, evolved into something far more complex. By the mid-1970s, evidence suggests the project had been compromised. Certain researchers began actively assisting the entities in improving their mimetic capabilities and facilitating their integration into human society. The hunter listened intently, correlating this official information with what he had personally witnessed and documented. Each revelation validated his decision to expose the truth, despite the enormous personal cost. The victim count currently stands at 217 confirmed cases. The special agent continued, her voice taking on a grimmer tone. These represent individuals whose identities were appropriated by the entities, typically after isolation in remote locations. Most occurred within the past 20 years, though we have evidence suggesting the practice dates back much further. Identification has been complicated by the entity's apparent practice of using bone and tissue from their victims to refine their mimicry, similar to the assembly the hunter discovered in the original cabin. Images appeared on screen showing forensic excavations around various facility locations, including the cabin where the hunter's discovery had begun. The assembled bones he had found represented only a fraction of the evidence now being processed. As for arrests and indictments, 34 individuals have been taken into custody for direct involvement in facilitating the entity's activities. These include former project scientists, military personnel responsible for security protocols, and 3 high-ranking officials within the Department of Energy who diverted resources and provided cover for the operation. Charges range from conspiracy and obstruction to accessory to murder in cases where they assisted in victim acquisition. The briefing continued with detailed reports from each agency representative. The CDC spokesperson outlined containment protocols for the entities, emphasizing that while they appeared to possess intelligence and communication abilities, they showed no response to conventional interrogation techniques. The Department of Defense representative described ongoing efforts to identify any remaining infiltrators within sensitive positions, while a scientist from a newly formed research division presented preliminary findings on the entity's biology and capabilities. Of particular concern, the scientist explained, is their apparent collective intelligence. While each entity maintains individual autonomy, they demonstrate coordinated behaviors, suggesting a hive mind component or advanced communication network undetectable by our current technology. Those still at large may be aware of our containment methods and adapting accordingly. Throughout the briefing, the hunter noticed a careful linguistic shift that had occurred over the months of investigation. What had initially been referred to as specimens or subjects were now consistently called entities or infiltrators, terminology that acknowledged their agency and the threat they posed, rather than treating them as mere research subjects. After the formal briefing concluded, the FBI special agent approached the hunter directly. "The impact of your discovery extends well beyond what we can discuss in official settings," she said, maintaining the professional distance that characterized all their interactions. "The ripple effects are still expanding." She handed him a tablet containing security-cleared news reports from around the world. Similar investigations had been launched in 12 countries, triggered by the American revelations. International security protocols had been fundamentally revised. Public discourse around identity verification had transformed virtually overnight. "The local impact has been perhaps the most dramatic," the special agent continued. "The communities surrounding the northern forest have experienced something akin to collective trauma. Many have abandoned their homes entirely. Others remain but report profound psychological effects, persistent paranoia, sleep disturbances, breakdown of social trust. We've established support services, but recovery will take generations." The hunter had witnessed this transformation firsthand during his periodic returns to the region. The small town near where he had rented his cabin now resembled a ghost town, with businesses shuttered and houses standing empty. Those who remained moved through their daily routines with a haunted vigilance, constantly assessing their neighbors for signs of wrongness. On the national level, legislation has been introduced to create permanent oversight of all biological research programs, regardless of classification level, the special agent added. "The intelligence community is undergoing the most significant restructuring since 9/11. Public trust in institutions has reached historic lows, but demands for transparency have never been stronger." She hesitated, then added something more personal than her usual communications. "Was it worth it? The cost to you personally against these broader impacts?" The hunter considered the question carefully. His life had been irrevocably altered. His identity, though protected in official records, had become known through leaks and speculation. He had been separated from his children for their safety, communicating only through secure channels. His former life, the construction work, the weekend hunting trips, the quiet existence in familiar surroundings, was permanently lost. Truth has its own value, he finally replied, regardless of cost. The special agent nodded, accepting this philosophy without necessarily sharing it. The ceremony is tomorrow at the state capitol. Your presence has been requested by the governor and congressional delegation. Transport has been arranged. The hunter nodded, already uncomfortable with the public recognition that awaited him. In his mind, he had simply done what was necessary, what anyone would do when faced with a truth too significant to conceal. The idea of ceremonial acknowledgement seemed somehow inappropriate given the ongoing suffering of those affected and the enormity of what had been revealed about humanity's place in the universe. As he was escorted from the facility, he passed the secure containment area where the entities were held. Through reinforced observation windows, he caught glimpses of forms that shifted between human approximation and something entirely other. Movements fluid, yet wrong. Features almost but not quite correct. The entities seemed aware of his presence, their attention focusing on him with unsettling intensity as he passed. One creature, held in a specialized containment unit with enhanced security measures, pressed a limb against the transparent barrier as the hunter walked by. Its form stabilized briefly into a near-perfect human configuration, one that the hunter recognized with a chill of recognition as closely resembling his own. A message, perhaps, or a threat. The hunter maintained his pace, refusing to acknowledge the display. Outside the facility, spring birds called from the surrounding forest, their ordinary sounds a stark contrast to the profound abnormality contained within the fenced perimeter. Nature continued its cycles, indifferent to the revelation that something entirely non-terrestrial had been moving among its patterns for decades. The hunter took a deep breath of the pine-scented air, savoring its familiarity before being led to the vehicle that would transport him back to his temporary accommodations. Tomorrow would bring public recognition he neither sought nor desired. Today, at least, he could take some satisfaction in seeing the full extent of what his discovery had unveiled. The beginning of understanding rather than ignorance, however painful that understanding might be. The state capitol building stood as a monument to institutional permanence, its granite facade and imposing dome designed to convey stability and authority. Today, however, it served as the backdrop for a ceremony acknowledging that such institutions had fundamentally failed in their most basic responsibility, recognizing the difference between human and other. The hunter felt profoundly out of place as he was ushered through marble corridors to the governor's reception room. His practical attire, the best he owned, but still reflecting his working-class background, contrasted sharply with the formal suits and military dress uniforms surrounding him. Security personnel maintained a protective cordon, less to prevent outside threats than to manage the intense media interest in the man whose discovery had transformed global security paradigms. The governor, flanked by 2 U.S. senators and the state's congressional delegation, greeted the hunter with the practiced warmth of career politicians. Television cameras captured the handshakes and brief exchanges, broadcasting them to a public still ravenous for any information related to the entity infiltration. On behalf of the people of Minnesota, and indeed the entire nation, we express our profound gratitude for your courage and persistence, the governor began as the formal ceremony commenced. When confronted with something beyond conventional understanding, you chose truth over convenience, public safety over personal security. The hunter stood uncomfortably at the podium, listening as various officials detailed the significance of his actions. Awards were presented, a special congressional recognition, a medallion from the governor, a plaque from federal law enforcement agencies. He accepted each with minimal acknowledgement, increasingly eager to redirect attention to what he considered more important aspects of the ongoing situation. When finally given an opportunity to speak, the hunter approached the microphone with visible reluctance. "These recognitions should go to the victims," he began, his voice rough-edged but steady. "The people whose lives were taken so these entities could better imitate us. Their families, who may never know what happened to their missing loved ones. The communities permanently altered by the knowledge that something non-human walked among them, wearing familiar faces." He paused, gathering thoughts he had prepared but now struggled to articulate under the harsh lights and scrutinizing cameras. "I'm no hero. I simply found something that couldn't be ignored and refused to look away. The real recognition should go to the journalist who believed this impossible story and helped expose it when authorities wouldn't listen. to the few officials who immediately understood the implications and acted despite institutional resistance, to those now working to ensure nothing like this can happen again. The hunter's gaze swept across the assembled dignitaries, many of whom represented the very institutions that had failed for decades to identify the infiltration, or worse, had actively facilitated it. 217 confirmed victims, he continued, his voice taking on an edge. People whose disappearances were dismissed as runaways, as accidents, as unsolvable mysteries. People whose reports of seeing something wrong were ignored or ridiculed. A system designed to protect us instead protected the secret of what was happening in those woods. That deserves acknowledgement too. An uncomfortable silence fell over the ornate room. The politicians shifted in their seats, the carefully crafted narrative of triumph threatened by this blunt assessment of institutional failure. But we know now, the hunter concluded, softening his tone slightly. Whatever happens next, whatever remains hidden, we at least know this much of the truth. That counts for something. The ceremony continued with additional speeches and presentations, but the hunter's direct words had altered the atmosphere. When it finally concluded, he was approached by family members of several victims, people who had traveled from across the country after learning their loved ones' disappearances were connected to the entity infiltration. A middle-aged woman grasped his hand with desperate intensity. "My brother vanished in those woods 20 years ago," she said. "Authorities said he must have gotten lost, had an accident, but I knew something took him. No one would believe me." Similar stories came from others. A father whose daughter disappeared while hiking, a husband whose wife never returned from a research trip, a son whose mother vanished during a routine drive through the national forest. The hunter listened to each with solemn attention, recognizing in their grief and vindication the true importance of what his discovery had revealed. Later, alone in his hotel room, the hunter stood at the window overlooking the city lights. The medals and plaques lay discarded on the bed, meaningful only as symbols of official acknowledgement rather than personal accomplishment. His thoughts turned to the broader implications of what had been unleashed. The entities had been on Earth for at least 7 decades according to official findings, possibly much longer. Their purpose remained unclear. Infiltration for what end? Observation? Gradual replacement? The captured specimens offered no explanations, and those still at large, and there were certainly some that remained undetected, continued their mimicry with unknown intentions. More troubling were the human collaborators, those who had knowingly assisted the entities. Their motivations ranged from scientific curiosity gone horrifically astray to darker ideologies that welcomed the replacement of humanity with something superior. Interrogations had revealed a quasi-religious element among some collaborators, a belief that the entities represented an evolutionary advancement that should be facilitated rather than resisted. The hunter's personal cost had been substantial. His identity, though officially protected, had become known through inevitable leaks. His home had been vandalized, forcing relocation to a secure facility. His former employer had terminated his position, citing security concerns and unwanted attention. His ex-wife had taken their children to another state, cutting off all contact out of fear that his notoriety endangered them. Yet despite these losses, the hunter felt a certain peace. The truth, however disturbing, had been brought to light. The entities could no longer operate in complete secrecy. Whatever their ultimate purpose, they now faced an aware and vigilant humanity. As night deepened outside his window, the hunter reflected on a conversation with the FBI special agent earlier that day. She had shared, off the record, that analysis of historical documentation suggested the infiltration might extend back centuries, not merely decades. Certain historical accounts of changelings and doppelgangers were being re-examined through the lens of what was now known about the entity's capabilities. "How long have they been watching us?" she had asked rhetorically. "How deeply have they influenced our development?" These questions may never be fully answered. The hunter had no special insight into such mysteries. He was, at his core, still the practical, methodical man who had entered those woods 6 months earlier. His contribution had been simple observation and stubborn insistence on truth, qualities that had proven more valuable than the specialized expertise of countless officials and researchers who had failed to see what was hidden in plain sight. Tomorrow he would return to the northern forests, not for ceremonies or briefings, but to begin rebuilding some semblance of a life. The truth had prevailed, at least partially. That would have to be enough. The hunter's truck followed the familiar curves of the forest road. tires crunching over the gravel surface that remained unchanged despite everything else that had been transformed. It had been 9 months since his discovery in the abandoned cabin, 7 since the public revelations, and 3 since the recognition ceremony that had marked the official acknowledgement of his role. He had purchased a small cabin on the opposite side of the lake from his former rental, far enough from the investigation sites to avoid constant reminders, but close enough to the forest that had been his sanctuary for decades. The property sat at the end of a private road, with sufficient isolation to provide the solitude he now craved more than ever. The construction company had not asked him to return, and he had not pursued reinstatement. Instead, he had accepted a position as a special consultant to the U.S. Forest Service, not investigating the entities, but rather using his intimate knowledge of the northern woods to help restore the natural areas disrupted by the massive federal operation. The role kept him connected to the land he loved while providing enough income for his modest needs. As he drove, the hunter found himself automatically scanning the tree line with the heightened awareness that had once served him in tracking deer, but now focused on subtler anomalies, unnatural stillness, shapes that didn't quite match their surroundings, movements that followed patterns no woodland creature would exhibit. The entities had changed not just the world's understanding of what existed beyond human experience, but the very way the hunter perceived his environment. He had not personally encountered another entity since his confrontation in the cabin and subsequent escape from the research facility, yet he could not shake the certainty that they remained present in these woods, watching, adapting, perhaps even now developing new methods of concealment in response to humanity's awareness. The hunter turned onto the narrow access road leading to his new cabin. Unlike his temporary quarters during the investigation or the impersonal hotel rooms during official debriefings, this place was beginning to feel like his own, a space where he could gradually process everything that had occurred and perhaps eventually find some measure of normalcy. Inside, the cabin's simple furnishings reflected his practical nature. A wood stove provided heat. Bookshelves held volumes on local wildlife and forestry, now supplemented with scientific papers on xenobiology and morphological plasticity, subjects he had never imagined would become relevant to his life. A secure satellite connection linked him to ongoing investigation updates and provided a monitored communication channel to his children, who remained with their mother in another state. The hunter prepared a simple meal and ate while reviewing notes for the next day's forest restoration work. The federal operation had created significant environmental disruption, heavy equipment accessing remote areas, excavations around suspected entity activity sites, security perimeters requiring cleared vegetation. His task was to assess these impacts and develop rehabilitation plans that would allow the forest to heal while maintaining necessary monitoring access. As twilight approached, he found himself drawn to a particular location, not the cabin where everything had begun, which remained within a restricted area, but a promontory overlooking the lake that had featured in his earliest hunting memories. The spot offered a panoramic view of the forest he had known intimately for decades, now forever changed in his perception. The hunter parked at the end of a service road and hiked the remaining half-mile to the overlook. Spring had fully established itself, with tender green leaves unfurled on deciduous trees and new growth brightening the tips of evergreen branches. Nature continued its cycles, indifferent to the revelations about non-terrestrial entities or the human response to their discovery. At the promontory, the hunter settled on a familiar rock formation that had served as his observation point during countless previous visits. The lake spread before him, its surface reflecting the deepening blue of the evening sky. In the distance, barely visible, federal security lights marked the perimeter of the main investigation zone. Beyond that, he knew, lay the cabin where he had first encountered evidence of the entities. The hunter sat in silence as darkness gradually claimed the landscape, stars emerging overhead in patterns unchanged since his childhood. He had come here not merely for the view or the solitude, but as a personal ritual of remembrance, acknowledging the victims whose identities had been stolen, the communities fractured by fear and suspicion, and his own former life, now irrevocably lost. Yet mixed with this somber reflection was a measure of peace. The truth, however disturbing, had been revealed. Systems of accountability, however imperfect, had been established. Humanity now moved forward with awareness rather than ignorance, however uncomfortable that awareness might be. As full darkness settled over the forest, the hunter noticed something unusual at the lake's edge below, a subtle luminescence that didn't match any natural phenomenon he recognized. He raised his binoculars, focusing on the gentle blue-green glow that seemed to emanate from the water itself. The light moved with purpose, forming patterns too regular to be attributed to bioluminescent organisms or reflective minerals. It pulsed in sequences that suggested communication rather than random natural processes. Most disturbing, it appeared to be expanding, tendrils of luminescence extending from the lake into the surrounding shoreline. The hunter documented the phenomenon with his phone, following protocols established for reporting potential entity activity. Yet he felt no urgency to alert emergency response teams or flee the area. Whatever this manifestation represented, whether related to known entities or something entirely different, it confirmed what he had suspected since his initial discovery. The full extent of non-terrestrial presence remained far from completely understood or contained. Some mysteries would persist, some questions would remain unanswered, and humanity would need to adapt to a new understanding of its place in a universe more complex and populated than previously imagined. The hunter accepted this reality with the same pragmatic stoicism that had characterized his response to the original discovery. He remained at the promontory until the luminescence gradually faded, then made his way back to his vehicle in darkness, navigating by instinct and memory rather than artificial light. The forest around him breathed with familiar sounds, the rustle of nocturnal creatures, the whisper of wind through pine needles, the distant call of an owl. Yet beneath these known patterns lurked the awareness of something other, something that had perhaps always been present but only recently recognized. The hunter moved through this altered reality with neither fear nor denial, but with the clear-eyed acceptance that had allowed him to expose the truth when others would have looked away. The October frost returned to the forest, completing the cycle of seasons since the hunter had first stumbled upon the abandoned cabin. He stood at the edge of a clearing different from that fateful location, but similar in its isolation and quiet beauty. His breath formed small clouds in the chill morning air, just as it had on that day that changed everything. In his hand he held a simple marker, a polished river stone etched with no names or dates, only a simple symbol representing truth revealed. He placed it carefully at the base of a white oak, its trunk wider than the span of his arms, reminiscent of the tree where he had paused for coffee on that morning before his discovery. The hunter had come to understand that truth, like the entities themselves, was rarely absolute or fixed. It shifted and evolved, revealed itself in fragments, and often defied complete comprehension. What he had exposed was merely one layer of a reality far more complex than humanity had previously acknowledged. Yet even partial truths held value. The knowledge that non-terrestrial biological entities existed among humans had fundamentally altered humanity's perception of its place in the universe. The revelation that these entities could mimic human form had transformed concepts of identity and security. The exposure of decades-long institutional complicity had reshaped governance and oversight systems. The hunter knelt beside the marker stone, running his fingers over its smooth surface. He had placed similar memorials at locations throughout the forest, private commemorations for the victims whose remains had been found, whose identities had been appropriated, whose lives had been sacrificed to enable the entity's infiltration. These small acts of remembrance would never compensate for what had been lost. The full truth might never be completely known. The entities that remained undetected might never be found. Yet the hunter had done what was within his power. He had seen, understood, and revealed what others had concealed. As he rose and prepared to return to his cabin, the hunter noticed something half buried in the forest floor nearby, a small, metallic object reflecting the morning sunlight. He knelt again and carefully brushed away the covering of pine needles and soil. A camera, modern, weatherproof, with a government property tag partially visible beneath accumulated grime. The hunter left it undisturbed, now unsurprised by evidence of long-term surveillance in these woods. The watching continued from all sides. Entities observing humans, humans monitoring for entities, each studying the other with a mixture of fear and fascination. The hunter turned away from the clearing and began the hike back to his cabin. The forest around him remained beautiful despite what he now knew existed within it, perhaps even more precious for the awareness of how easily its apparent permanence could be disrupted, how thoroughly its familiar patterns could conceal profound abnormality. This was the truth he had discovered in that abandoned cabin, not just about non-terrestrial entities or government conspiracies, but about reality itself. Beneath the surface of the ordinary lay the extraordinary, waiting to be recognized by those willing to truly see. The hunter moved through the forest with the quiet confidence that came from years spent reading the subtle language of the wilderness. Each step carried him forward into a future fundamentally altered by his past actions, yet somehow circling back to where he had begun, a man finding his way through the woods, attentive to signs others might miss, following truth wherever it led. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to subscribe for more investigative thrillers that explore the boundaries between the known and the unknowable, the ordinary and the extraordinary. The truth is out there, sometimes in the most unexpected places, like an abandoned cabin in the northern woods.